Good morning, everyone. For today, we will discuss philosophy on self identity. So, our learning objectives are the following: to understand how philosophy defines the self, to learn about the different ways that the self is described, and to learn the implications and gaps of this perspective. So, how does philosophy define the self? In philosophy, the self is understood through various lenses, with no single definitive answer, as it depends on how one resolves key questions about personal identity. It mainly defines the self by addressing fundamental questions about personal identity, such as the persistence question, the population question, the personal ontology question, and what matters in identity. Because of this, many perspectives have emerged, each offering unique ways to understand and define the self. The psychological continuity perspective defines the self in terms of consciousness or mental activity. It believes that psychological relations are necessary and sufficient for being. It also views the self as something immaterial and something that begins its existence in the emergence of our psychological states. So, for example, psychological continuity theorists would suggest that we were never embryos or fetuses in the womb, as they do not yet have consciousness or psychological states at all. Another approach, the brute physical view or animalism, identifies the self with a biological organism, emphasizing physical continuity over psychological traits. For instance, even if someone loses all mental faculties due to a persistent vegetative state, animalism would hold that the self persists as long as the organism remains alive. While this aligns with biological survival, it struggles to explain moral responsibility or the importance of psychological connections. The self is also conceived as an immaterial soul by some, persisting independently of physical or psychological states. In religious contexts, for example, the idea that the soul survives death supports this perspective. However, this view is less popular due to difficulties explaining its interaction with the body. Alternatively, Jungian philosophy argues that the self is merely a bundle of changing mental states without a unified core, akin to a theater where perceptions play out. This view raises challenges such as explaining how we remain accountable for our actions over time. Finally, relational and practical theories suggest that the self is defined by psychological connections that sustain moral and practical relationships over time, emphasizing what matters in practice rather than metaphysical identity. For example, someone who remembers their past and plans for their future feels a deep concern for that continuity, even if certain physical or psychological traits change. Overall, all these perspectives collectively reveal the complexity of defining the self, each highlighting different aspects of identity, continuity, and existence.
The self is framed as the locus of great power and the primary barrier to achievement and can be understood in different ways. Two key perspectives that provide valuable insights are the narrative perspective and the character view. The narrative perspective suggests that our identities are shaped by the stories we share about ourselves, because it indicates the identities that are constructed from many experiences and choices we make. It implies how creating a sense of self is an ongoing process. Additionally, these are usually details that are shared during introductions, events, first dates, memoirs, and so on. The narrative perspective sees our sense of self as built from countless memories and future plans, which helps explain why certain actions and traits feel like core parts of who we are. While others seem more random or incidental, the self reflects our choices, highlighting the role of free will and personal responsibility in determining our paths. The character view emphasizes that when we construct our identities and interpret those of others, we aim to create a meaningful connection among behaviors, habits, and memories, forming a cohesive understanding of ourselves and others rather than solely looking for just a simple collection of traits.
The verticality of the viewpoint.
Olson's perspective about the self holds veracity to some extent. His viewpoint is heavily grounded in biology and aligns with observable facts such as life and death, where when the body of a person ceases to function, we typically consider that person to no longer exist. However, Olson fails to acknowledge the complexities of a person as an experience of being within relational and psychological contexts. And the problem with animalism is that it fails to argue with thought experiments such as brain transplants and hypothetical situations of the traits of a person being altered. Also, in the end, does acknowledge that it cannot be isolated into one and that the self is encompassed by a much larger structure of different complexities. However, his arguments during the reading were heavily grounded in biology, and while his arguments does capture a very essential dimension of the self is much more than just someone who is stuck inside a body.
Although Olson enjoys a view that such theories must be based on significant scientific, more so an animalist approach, Olson has failed to construct a concept that implores the significance of the memory, consciousness, and other elements which may hold an importance in discovering the self. Olson failed and underestimated significant factors which may have shaped or influenced one's identity, such as social structures and institutions. However, there must be no disregard with Olson's view of human identity, for his concept provided that we are biological organisms, which is a fact and empirical.
Now, how does this perspective have implications to one's day to day, everyday life? One great implication of our change in viewing in this perspective will be the viewing identity in the context of ourselves as being in the form of our mental activity and consciousness that can have major implications on our own understanding of self. It raises a good question on how we view those who have mental illnesses that hamper their mental activity and memory, for example, dementia and amnesia. Another great change in our perspective will be our viewpoint on our relationships. We may view relationship towards this perspective much differently as dramatic changes in one's personality or makeup can feel as though they have lost the person that they have used to know, and the continuance of the relationship being solely based on the continuity of our partners of or one's character over time.
Another implication of self in everyday life is the limit of authenticity. Authenticity is defined as being honest to not only others, but also to themselves without any external influence. When one's authenticity is revealed to others, it could cause conflict and issues with those who might not agree with them, as well as expectations that society has on them. This could lead to one's true feelings or beliefs being hidden to avoid conflict or judgment from others. One has to contemplate on how much of their true self can be shown and how to express themselves in situations.
Gaps between our understanding of the self and these perspectives view.
While these views bring up valid points and fresh perspectives, there are some points that conflict with our own understanding of the self. Firstly, the psychological continuity perspective seems to focus solely on the consciousness and mental activity, disregarding the physical body as part of the self. However, this seems to neglect the importance of the body in selfhood, such as how physical health conditions may impact one's sense of self. Next, the notion that embryos and people with their mental states destroyed are not regarded as persons is also something that goes against our own understanding of the self. It is claimed that we do not start existing for months or even years after we are born, and stop existing after our cognitive abilities have considerably degraded. This view can have severe ethical implications that do not align with ours. Next, the idea that changes in mental states affect identity does not align with our understanding, as change in personality and preferences might be seen as the body's adaptive response rather than a loss of self.
The perspectives in the readings give valid points, but in my understanding of the self, it is a collection of our experiences and emotions, which shapes who we are today, and that the self is influenced by the surroundings. And the same concept can be applied to how transplanting a brain to another could make them think that they are the other, but in truth, the experiences or the memories the other has gathered is changing or shaping a new version of ourselves. Another example are people who have dementia. Even if they forget aspects of their own identity and develop new habits, they will still be themselves. The difference being is that they have adapted to the changes that has influenced them, but will still have remnants of who they were before through the experiences their own body has gathered. This shows that people continue to change over time and will continue to adapt to the changes. Another situation will be is when a person were to remember their past, they would still be themselves but with new personalities and perspectives, shaped by the influence of their environment and the experiences they have gathered.